My name is Kimberly. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist at a message that my internet is bad. So I'm going to pause and just check everything over here. So what I'm going to do is try to talk through my phone. So y'all let me know if this works better. I'll keep my camera on the computer, but I will talk on my phone. I realize that is not ideal, so I appreciate everyone's patience here. If you go to the, oh, I'm glad, it's great. Go to the Slido. So we're going to be using Slido throughout the day. I love Slido because you can ask questions throughout, and also I can ask you questions throughout. And so you're just going to go to slido.com and put in this number code. Hopefully there's enough sixes in it. My 6 keys broken. So the first question is, why are you here today? Would love to get some responses to this. So go ahead and join at the code. Let us know why you're here. Gotta get the CE credits. So throughout this, you're sometimes your responses will come live and everyone will see all things. And sometimes it'll be word clouds, but we really just want to know and hear from you. This is an active participation. I wish that we were all in person to be able to commune together. That's my collective nature, but now I am glad to see responses here. So yeah, keep them coming. CE credits, work in crisis, be better advocate, gain knowledge, love, neurodivergent clients. Yes. So a lot of you were attracted to the intersectionality of the topic. Izzy should be with her family today. That's true. Awesome. Thanks for your participation. I am gonna move it on, but I can keep all these responses for my benefit. I'm heartbroken for Izzy too. Okay, so what we're going to be doing today, just going to take a moment to remember who Izzy was or is. Look at the problem and the context of the problem and work together to identify ethical principles that are at stake. Then we're going to look at clinically some things that would help inform our discussion about intersectional suicide risk, and then finally look at the role that we have as advocates and our role as mental health professionals, or however we are joining this conversation. I also have a lot of my friends joining me today, friends and colleagues, people that I respect, who have helped me with this, and I just have a lot of gratitude for them and their voices that you'll hear today, both in person through the presentation and also through their work that they have shared with me. So I thank you. Okay, first I want to remember this beautiful girl, Izzy. This comes from her obituary. And I'll just read. Isabella Izzy Faith Tichenor passed away on November 6, 2021 at the tender age of 10. Izzy was born in Salt Lake City, Utah on May 15, 2011. She was a beautifully unique soul full of love and kindness. She was bright and gifted. She touched the hearts of so many. She loved to sing, dance, and be the best sister to her siblings. She wanted to be a professional dancer in New York or a professional cheerleader when she grew up. She also enjoyed gymnastics, time with family, and spending time in praise and worship to Jesus Christ, her Savior. This was a real person that lived and had hopes and dreams for the future that she will not have. And so let's look at the problem. So this comes from some of the news coverage about Izzy's case. And here you see her mother, Brittany, holding a picture of Izzy on her phone. If you read a number of the news stories about this, in essence, there were a number of incidents of bullying in Izzy's school, which is in North Salt Lake, Davis County, both on the part of students in her class, but also when Brittany would try to talk to the teacher about what's happening. Not only did she find the teacher to be unresponsive, she found the administration to be unresponsive. And when Brittany would talk to Izzy about what was happening, she felt that the teacher did not like her and would not advocate for her in the classroom. And so on November 6th, Izzy died by suicide. So she made an attempted hanging and then ended up in the hospital for several days and then died by suicide. Was found by her siblings, which is especially sad. So this is a traumatic event that will linger for the family, which was already traumatic through the course of Izzy's life. So in Davis County School District, Black and Asian American students account for 1% of students in the district. So in a district of 73,000, that's about 700 students. And the district, as you might have also seen in the news, was evaluated by the Department of Justice, and it was found that there is widespread racial harassment of Black and Asian students, hundreds of documented uses of the N-word and other racial epithets, harsher discipline for students of color in the district, and students of color were denied the ability to form student groups, even though similar requests were granted to other students. And the overall indictment from the report is that the district was found to be deliberately indifferent to student complaints about racism in their schools. And this mirrors what Izzy's mother said, that when she went for help, for somebody to do something, people did not show up for her. So there is an episode of Radio West that talked about who's responsible for racism in Davis County and the rest of Utah. So we're going to test my sound here, but if it is not good on my computer, then I will give you the highlights.
Cheryl Ellsworth is a former school teacher. Deidre Strait is a teacher at Highland High School in the Salt Lake School District. Cheryl Ellsworth went first.
I wasn't surprised. You know, as a former education specialist at the State Board of Education, I knew of the work that Davis County has been trying to do to mitigate some of these kinds of things from happening. But I also kind of saw it as everyone was speeding and Davis County is the one that got the ticket.
Yeah.
I know there are things happening in Alpine, Nebo, from Washington County to Box Elder. I think we need to recognize as a state that these issues are happening everywhere.
Yeah. Deidre, what about you?
I was heartbroken when I heard the story.
Yeah.
I think it was shocking to see the numbers, to see it so quantified. And I think that even when you suspect that there are issues in a school or a school district or a town or an area, to see those numbers, but then also to see the charge that there was a deliberate indifference, that is crushing.
Yeah. The deliberate indifference thing actually is kind of a theme I wanted to talk to you both about today, because I wonder if something like that exists in faith communities as well. But First of all, I wanted to ask you how you reacted to the type of racism that was revealed in those reports, because this wasn't passive. Some of it was, I guess. Some of it was just kind of dumb, insensitive stuff that kids would say who are ignorant or whatever. But a lot of it was really ugly. The N-word multiple times, time after time after time, kids using the N-word. References to slavery, just really ugly. So what did you make of that part of it? I don't know if that surprised you, but this wasn't just sort of dumb stuff that a kid would say. It was really, really, I don't know, violent and ugly.
Doug, I know in 2021, I personally know 7 families, specifically Black families, who moved out of the state of Utah. And when I was talking to them and I'm like, why are you leaving? Why are you moving? It was because of these kinds of things. And it's frustrating because as a Black person, I'm tired of thinking that when my kids are young, so my friends who are a little bit older than me are saying things to me like, Cheryl, when your kids experience racism, ... They're not saying if they do. Yeah. They say when. These are the kinds of things that we have to do, which really stresses me out and frustrates me. As a family, we're also moving. We're not staying here. And I just don't like the idea that it's like a normal part of many Black kids' experience here in Utah to hear the N-word by the time they're 5. For their friends to ask for a pass to use the N-word by the time they're in middle school. Awful things happening at high school on sports teams. Monkey sounds being made when a Bountiful football team comes out. You know, on the fields, like, it's not okay that it's supposed to be just, like, part of the Black experience here. And, like, a little piece of me died inside where I'm just like, I have to make a choice to protect my children when I think about their future, because I don't want this to be an experience that is just like part of living here in Utah.
I have older children who've graduated high school in Salt Lake City School District. And even though it's a far more diverse district, there are still issues. And so some of those I've heard, and I work at a high school, I have students tell me that they are looked at or something is said when there's a discussion of slavery. So these are common comments and discussions or treatment across regard. So it's not just Davis County in that respect.
Who's responsible? And I'll suggest a few things here in a moment, but I just want to leave it hanging out there. Who's responsible?
Honestly, when you asked me to come on the show, I felt a little bit sad because I thought to myself, this radio host who I've never met in real life cares to know how I feel about this, yet my local community, my ward, hasn't asked me how this has impacted me. Izzy's suicide is specifically what I'm talking about. Death by suicide by a child who's 10 years old, who's a Black child who experienced racial bullying. And I haven't had people in my own congregation say, like, I've heard, I've seen, I'm with you, I care about your children. I don't want this to be something that we experience in our community. That wasn't the reaction that happened for us, and it feels lonely. And so the responsibility is on all of us, but I feel like it's left to the marginalized communities to speak up.
Are you seeing a particular
I'm doing this to navigate sound, but I want to get some reactions to this in the chat because I forgot to put it inside of. But I want to know just what are people's responses to hearing just the accounts of what was shared. Cheryl Ellsworth is a former teacher and also a former Board of Education employee. and Deidre is a teacher as well. Just what are people's responses to the things happening in Davis County, the things that you heard, the ways that people are being responded to in their communities. If you look at in the news, we have all of these things happening right now. So on the left is a picture of the protests that were happening earlier in the year, when, and I don't even know if you could call them protests, but there's a group of Black activists and educators in the community that wanted to support talks about critical race theory in order to keep discussion going, but not facilitate a ban in schools. There's also been powerful communities of parents that want to ban critical race theory in schools, even though critical race theory is not a thing that is happening in schools. I just want to draw attention that somebody went to the junior high that Izzy attended and wasn't surprised and sad to see that things have changed. And if you look the story up in the news, there were other people that came forward from Izzy's school system that said, you know, these things were happening to us too. We have a school board official, a state elected school board official that spends quite a lot of her social capital speaking out against things that would protect the marginalized in our schools. Here you have her reacting to discussions of microaggressions in the school. She also advocates for the banning of social emotional learning, which should concern all of us who are mental health professionals. And then we have rules, you know, the bill that just passed in committee to have teachers post their materials online for 30 days in advance, which not only, if I had to post my stuff 30 days in advance, you know, I don't know what would be there, but also just the oversight that is required and the level of the oversight that people are trying to gain in large part to stop teachers from teaching things that would protect the marginalized. It's really hard to see. And so I wonder how often are we speaking up and speaking out, as Michelle was saying. So let's identify some ethical principles. We're here for ethics. So solving ethical dilemma necessitates identifying the ethical principles being violated, and APA, the Psychological Association, is working off of these 5 principles: striving to do no harm, establishing relationships of trust, being aware of our responsibility to society, promoting accuracy, honesty, and truthfulness in science, recognizing that fairness and justice entitle all people to be able to access to contributions of psychology, and that we respect the dignity and worth of all people, which is all well and good as ethical principles, like I'm for it. And then we consider that there's perspectives that are left out of our ethics code based on the time that they were designed, who they were designed by, what are we missing, even when we're talking about a discussion of ethics. There was a meeting of the Society of Indian Psychologists, the National Latina and Latino Psychological Association, ABPSI, who broke off from APA a long time ago, and the Asian American Psychological Association. They had a meeting about the ethical principles in 2013, and they in essence said that even if our ethical principles are good, they largely reflect white ethnocentric values, because people were not included, a diverse group of people were not included in the development of our ethical guidelines. And so Daryl Wing Sue said ethical guidelines can unwittingly be used to advance cultural oppression. When we're missing perspectives, we also have to be looking at that as well. The Society of Indian Psychologists released a 3-part rebuttal to the APA Ethics Code about 10 years ago. and there's a 96-page document that discusses at length their issues with the ethics code. But it can be summed up in this statement: effective psychology is contextual and relational. Competent psychology is honest. Honest psychology recognizes culture. So our ethical principles are kind of culturally devoid. The National Latina and Latino Psychological Association has their own set of ethical principles, and they talk about the universal value of connectedness, collective consciousness, language diversity, heterogeneity among Latino people, and a commitment to justice. Now you're seeing that even though even with those values, they're a lot more collectivist than our APA ethical guidelines are. The Association of Black Psychologists, which largely is devoted to the uplifting of Black people, also have a different ethics code. And it includes consubstantiation, which is the idea that I am because we are, and responsibility to each other, restraint. So having a personal responsibility to not do harm, even if it means restraining your own tendencies to intervene in a situation, respect, reciprocity, commitment, and courage. Now, can you imagine like what kind of world we would live in if our ethics code was more collective like this? Then it would help us better be able to stand up and feel a responsibility to intervene in these situations. And so after this meeting of these 4 organizations, they are actively working with the APA to revise our ethics code to include more of these social justice, collectivist values. And so it'll be interesting to see if we as a field can kind of rise to meet what is being called a values course correct for the organization. Real quick, I'm just going to check and see if a guest is here. I don't think she is. Go ahead. Someone is unmuted. Okay. I have 3 more slides and then I'm going to skip some. I'm waiting for Dr. LaShawn Williams to come as she is watching her child at a school spelling bee where she should be. So I will keep going. Somebody has unmuted their microphone. Does somebody have something to say? Did I? Okay. So there, if we're looking at our ethical principles, we have competence as an issue. And we have this idea that psychologists provide services and conduct research in the bounds of their competence. And we're striving to maintain our competence, and we have a responsibility to gain that confidence when it comes to intersectionality of marginalized populations. In essence, if we're not found confident in those areas, we are to refer, except if there is an emergency. So an emergency, psychologists can provide services even if they don't have the necessary training, and the services are discontinued as soon as the emergency has ended. And so then I'm wondering aloud, well, when is a crisis an emergency? So we have this situation in Davis County that involves bullying, it involves racism, it involves neurodiverse populations, and we may not all have competence in those areas, but then when there's a crisis that leads to death of the student population, that leads to an indictment from the federal government, when does that constitute an emergency in which we would rise to the occasion to help solve problems? I think Dr. LaShawn's ears were burning because I saw her come in. LaShawn, are you here?
Yes, I am.
I turned my volume down on my phone. So I am pleased to welcome Dr. LaShawn Williams, relational change strategist extraordinaire. She's the owner of Relational Spaces, the owner of the new Utah Center for Connection in Utah County, which I will let her explain, but is an awesome initiative prioritizing care of BIPOC individuals by BIPOC and for BIPOC individuals. She's a co-founder of the Black Clinicians with myself, which I don't think I mentioned. And she is also assistant professor of social work at Salt Lake Community College. Dear friend, so glad to welcome her here. How did your girl do in the spelling bee?
Oh, we showed up strong in the first round, and then we got surprised by the word stopped, the double P in the word stopped. It kind of took us out, came from behind. We didn't see it coming, phonetics and whatnot. Third grade, we were practicing the strong words, Quasimodo, right?
Yeah.
Technique, right?
They switch up the strategy.
They do. Microphones weren't working. I was ready to call, a technicality on it, but it's okay. We had a big bag of candy. We got a little spelling bee pen. We had our emotions for a little bit. Walked back into third grade. The class clapped for her. There were 15 kids that made it for the full school spelling bee. She was number 5. We were celebrating the victory. And I mean, we were it started at 9:30. We were done by 9:37. I'm 9:47. So it's okay. But we gave it a good effort. That's it. Thank you so much. Hey, thank you for having me here. I promise not to take up too much of your time or to interrupt. You can finish the slide that you were on. I can just pop in later.
I'm ready for you.
Okay, all right. Thank you all for being here. I'm Dr. LaShawn C. Williams. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, doctorate in education with healthcare and mental health professionals. As Dr. Applewhite stated, my professional title is relational change strategist. I work with people at the intersections of relationships to create connection where those relationships matter most. I've been in higher ed for about 20 years. And as I see our terminology shift and change, and as I bring new social workers into the profession, I often talk with them about the power of the relationship as our code of ethics and as our educational policies and standards, as they shift and change, as we adjust to the world that we are entering and re-entering as professionals. Our responsibility to relationship is most important. And so I focus on, honestly, those strategies for change in relationship. As Dr. Applewhite mentioned, I'm the owner here of Relational Spaces in Orem, Utah. I have had Relational Spaces since 2017 as an outgrowth of my private practice, identity growth and change, my rebranding. I wanted to focus more on being able to do some consultations and trainings within the mental health community and the communities at large where I am a member. And with Dr. Applewhite, we co-founded the Black Clinicians. And now I have the Utah Center for Connection, which is centering the lives and experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, which is to the inclusion of non-BIPOC communities, because by assisting those of us inside the BIPOC community with skills and strategies to survive structural and systemic oppressions, by also empowering those outside of BIPOC communities to change those systems and structures of oppression, we are able to center the health, the well-being, the growth, and the thriving of BIPOC communities. And we just opened our doors here January 1, 2022, and we are a collective of practitioners, clinicians, a couple of nonprofits who are here working to close the gaps that exist in mental health care and psychoeducational support in Utah County. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I'm really excited. I wanted to speak with you all just very briefly about our ethical principles around our dimensions of diversity. And so on the next slide, the NASW, our code of ethics, we are actually in a conversation right now about our EPAS, our educational policies and standards, which gear how all of our programs are accredited. And we're talking a lot about how we discuss diversity. But in our code of ethics, it stems from our 6 core values in social work. And those 6 core values are service, integrity, competence, the dignity and worth of the person, the importance of human relationships, and social justice. And each of those core values extends into an ethical principle, which then is outlined by specific ethical standards. And there are two in our code of ethics that I wanted to focus on, not just for social workers, but for all of us. And I just wanted to speak with you a little bit about the language. So our code of ethics is divided by our responsibilities to clients, our responsibilities to colleagues, to the profession, and really to the community and to the world. And so in our responsibilities to clients, the first one, 1.01 subsection C, says that social workers should obtain education about and seek to understand. So obtain education about and seek to understand, this is the important piece, the nature of social diversity and oppression. So when you think about what is the nature of social diversity and oppression, what does that require of us? Because it says that we should find and understand the nature of social diversity and oppression with respect to this list of dimensions: race, ethnicity, national origin, color, sex, sexual orientation, age, marital status, political belief, religion, and mental or physical ability and disability. Gender identity and expression has also been added into that. And how many of those things can you see when you look at a person? This is why I focus on the need for us to really key in on the power of relationships, because the only thing that you can actually see is color. And what's the one thing that we have all been socialized to say in these difficult conversations around race and racism and ethnicity? I don't see color. But if that's the one thing that you can actually see out of this list before you can get to any of these other ones, which require you to have a relationship with the person, what does it mean for us to understand the nature of social diversity and oppression if we can't even say that we see color? So when we're talking about understanding the nature of social diversity and oppression, we're talking about what created it. What has created social diversity? What has created and sustained oppression? If we're going to understand the nature of something, that's going to be, yes, obtaining an education and seeking to understand the nature is, how did we get here? And so a conversation like this around understanding all the things that contributed to and exacerbated the experiences of Izzy and her family and other Black people and communities here in Utah, and Indigenous communities and larger communities of color, what is the nature of our diversity and our experiences with oppression? One of the things that's so difficult for all of us in the helping profession is that we are helping people survive systems while actively working to try and change them. And for those of you or those of us that sit in places of privilege or that sit outside of the BIPOC communities that we are serving, what is our responsibility to understand the nature of social diversity? Understanding, how did we get here? What has contributed to it in my lifetime that I need to better understand? It's not about your personal responsibility. It's not about your personal contributions, but to the oppressive system as it stands. But it is about your personal contributions to dismantling the system. And sometimes we do that here, right, in our actual therapy offices. In other ways, we do that through our conversations or through our policy initiatives, through how we train and retain our staff, how we recruit to populations that we want to serve, but how we also recognize our abilities or our limitations when it may come to serving that population. So our responsibility to clients is an ethical responsibility to understand the nature of social diversity and the nature of oppression, which is not the experience, it's the nature of it. How did it come to be? And however it came to be, what is my role in that? So on the next slide, the Code of Ethics talks about our responsibilities as professionals. So now we're to understand the nature of it. It also says that when it comes to this concept of discrimination, as social workers, and I'll say as helping professionals, we should not practice, condone, facilitate, or collaborate with any form of discrimination on the basis of that same list that I just outlined before: race, ethnicity, national origin, color, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, age, marital status, political belief, religion, mental or physical abilities, right? And even in our Code of Ethics, we shift our language away from disability to ability, to differences in ability or accessibility. And so if our Code of Ethics can change in the service of of our healing and of our ability to fully support all communities, then we can too as professionals. So our responsibility as professionals is that we do not practice, condone, facilitate, or collaborate with. And you think about it with yourself. Okay, yep, I do not practice any form of discrimination. Great. Okay, wonderful. Condone. Well, no, I don't condone it. What do you do? Because a lot of times we condone things by simply not speaking out about it. Facilitating it. If I'm not facilitating it, I need to be interrupting it when it's happening. Otherwise, I am going to be silently or involuntarily collaborating with it. So when we think about it, okay, if I'm not practicing and I'm not condoning, I'm not facilitating, I'm not collaborating, then I should be interrupting. I should be dismantling. I should be deconstructing. I should be pointing out. I should be naming. I should be educating against, right? These are the responsibilities that we have as professionals. And so there's our public facing work to our clients and with our clients, but then there's also our internal work for us between professionals. And then we're going to talk about our own personal identity for us as professionals. But if I'm not practicing, condoning, facilitating, or collaborating, then I've got to be interrupting. And how do I interrupt? That's where a lot of us feel stuck or sticky or like, I don't know how to interrupt. I don't want to damage the relationship. What if I do this? What if someone gets mad at me? Understand that if somebody hurts your feelings because you call them out about something, you may have saved a life. One of the most difficult things when it comes to understanding our role as interrupters is that what hurts my feelings as a person that may sit in a position of privilege is costing somebody their life because of the oppression that's granted by my privilege. And so, yes, my feelings might get hurt when I interrupt any form of discrimination or when I interrupt some active oppressive element, some situation that's happening. My feelings might get hurt. That relationship might get hurt. But if I am interrupting oppression, I am saving a life and I am shifting the system, even if it's only in that moment. And so this is important for us to understand what that work looks like as our own ethical responsibility to ourselves as professionals, to our clients, as the people who are receiving our services. And so my last words with you are on this final slide about our responsibilities to ourselves and our professional identity. First, do no harm. Each of us as helping professionals working with the mind and the brain and the body and the community and society, first, do no harm. And so it's not enough to simply not do harm. We need to interrupt harmful practices and we need to interrupt harmful systems. And we can't interrupt what we don't identify. The question for all of us on a regular basis is this: are we moving toward or behaving like the professionals and people we say we want to be? I want to be an ethical social worker. What does that mean? What does that look like? What is my personal action plan when it comes to becoming more ethical? And maybe I can't do everything, but I can choose something that I can do. Because if, and more likely when, we are not moving in that direction, we simply owe it to ourselves to notice that we're offline, that we're out of alignment, that we are incongruent with the integrity that we say we have as people and as professionals. We need to unhook ourselves from whatever it is. I'm worried about this. What if they're mad at me? What if I lose a friend? What if I lose a job, right? If we're working in places that have systemic practices that are failing to recruit, that are failing, and not just to recruit, one of the things that I think is so important for all of us who are building our practices is how do we retain the people that we recruit? It's not enough for our checklist to say, yes, we have Connect 4. We've collected all of the things that make us look good on paper. What are we doing to train, to retain, to nurture their growth? What are we willing to actually give and to leverage on their behalf so that we can retain them and become an asset to the communities that they may represent and be connected to, that then buys us the privilege of trust in communities of color, because you may have a clinician of color on your staff. You are buying the trust, you're borrowing it based on who that person is that you have hired. Now, what you also need to be doing is making sure that you are nurturing, valuing, and doing all the things that you can to retain that person and equip them with the abilities that they already have and boost those abilities with resources, ongoing, reorganize your budgets to support them so that you've earned the trust that their presence has gotten you by being on your staff. So when we notice that we're offline, that we're out of alignment, that we're incongruent with who it is we say we need to be, pick an area where you would like to improve your ethics. Pick an area where you'd like to say, you know what, I want to make sure we're being very, very clear that we do not facilitate any sorts of oppressive practices. Let's do an audit and let's say, what's one thing we can work on for this year? Pick a word of the year. We're not going to condone, our word for 2022 is we are not facilitating any discrimination. Okay, what does that look like? Unhook yourselves from the thoughts, the feelings, the sensations, and then seek the support of the friends and the community that you have or that you should have as you're working in communities of color. Seek out the mentorship, seek out the supervision. At the Utah Center for Connection, we are building a consultation collective where we will meet and greet with people for at least 2 hours a month just to sit there and kind of talk through how's the case going. Like, trust the networks that are already existing and make those connections, because those of us who understand the profession are so much more well equipped to walk with you through that, and not just to walk with you, but to stumble along with you, because we know you want to do well. We know you want to improve. And if you're trusting us with your story, the way our clients trust us with theirs, it would be unethical of us to not point out that maybe you have a little bit of something in your teeth. Did you already do the J Smooth video, Dr. Applewhite? Did you do that one?
Not yet. We heard them with it at the end. If we ever.
Okay.
I don't know when the end is coming.
We'll make the connections there at that point in time. But we, if anything, and at the end of it all of us are doing exactly what we're asking and helping our clients to do, is to move towards our potential. And for us to move towards our professional and our personal ethics and values, and to bring them as closely together in the fabric of our being as possible. And it's necessary work. It's wholesome, valuable, hard, difficult, but worthy and good work. And maybe you can't do everything, but there is something that you can do. And you've got a community of clinicians of color ready to help and support you in that process so that we do no harm in the communities that we serve. So that's all that I've got. Dr. Applewhite, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you all and to share a few moments of my time with you.
Thanks, Dr. LaShawn. So go ahead and participate, folks, on the slide of what ethical principles you all think are at work. Something Dr. Williams said about the importance of recruitment. You come back, LaShawn. Something you said about recruitment and retention spoke to me as being especially important for a lot of reasons. You know, we usually strive as therapists to avoid multiple relationships, especially where they could cause harm to the client. One big issue in Utah, putting the thrust of the work to reach out in Black communities, especially on Black providers, is we don't have that many. And a lot of us know each other. A lot of us know the people that we're treating in some way or another, not always to the extent of an ethical violation, but still in a way that puts strain on our resources. And I even think about participating in this presentation today, how it's hard to be like one of few people of color at work and feel a responsibility to speaking out in certain situations. And so recruiting from a diverse population of people from a diverse populations of places comes crucial, not only in supporting the people that we're serving, but also supporting like our employees, the people that work for us. And so thank you so much for sharing. I don't know if you had anything to add. I just wanted to look at your face. It was making me feel better. So we've got, I love the phrase too about this being a disruptor, and how being somebody that doesn't condone certain things means that you are disruptive in certain systems. Oh, there goes the cloud. So all of these things are ways that we as mental health professionals have built in our code that prepare us to intervene so that there are no more needless deaths because of racism or bullying or lack of understanding or any of these things. So thanks everybody for contributing, and thank you, Dr. Williams, for being here and for showing me your face again. Okay, so we've got to fly, guys, because as usual, I have packed this thing. So Dr. Rowley, who is our acting program director of the assessment and testing program, who is here, but I will not ask her to share her slides unless she wants to, graciously contributed her expertise in the area of autism and has lit her expertise to specifically focusing on some unique considerations for Black people on the autism spectrum. So we have in the diagnosis of ASD these two core domains of deficits, social communication and interaction. And so this refers to like social emotional reciprocity, ability to get back and forth, nonverbal communication, which, you know, not only helps us to read, us as providers to read social cues, but also deficits in understanding the meaning of nonverbal communication from other people. And of course, this has an impact on relationships. So all that falls under social communication deficits. And then we also have restricted and repetitive types of behavior, you know, stereotype movements, insistence on routines, fixated patterns of interest, difficulty with sensory input, or unique interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So 1 in 54 children are diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder, and it occurs in all racial groups. And we see, I feel like, especially in Utah, we have some very talented assessors and people dedicated to getting more testing out there in the community. Prevalence is increasing across all racial groups, but it's unclear if we are overdiagnosing autism or if we're just better at recognizing just the nature, the span of what autism entails. We also know that we're still not capturing some people. There's still disparity of diagnosis in girls compared to boys, and in Black and Hispanic children are also underdiagnosed with autism compared to white children. So autism prevalence is reported to be highest among non-Hispanic white children, lower in Hispanic, Black, and Native American children, and highly variable in Asian and Pacific Islander populations. And there's a few potential hypotheses for this. There could be language barriers in assessing, in communicating behavior, limited economic resources. And so testing for autism is expensive, and so maybe not everybody is getting tested. Also, poverty increases risk in all kinds of areas, but it will affect your access to mental health care, access to health services, scheduling flexibility for comprehensive evaluations is key. It ties into limited economic resources being an outgrowth of that. Some parents are not able to take people out of school for 2, 3, 5 hour blocks at a time. And then there's also could be the impact of limited awareness of autism spectrum disorders, which is going to affect how you report symptoms. So there are just in people of color, more intellectual disability and language delays observed in Hispanic and Black children with autism spectrum disorders. Black children are 5 times more likely to be misdiagnosed with conduct disorders, which is a common thread that contributes to discrimination of Black children in schools, being overdiagnosed with conduct or disruptive behavior as opposed to other mental health diagnoses that qualify for IEPs 504 type support. Black parents reported fewer concerns about behaviors like delayed speech and repetitive behaviors, and reported more disruptive behaviors. So this is an interesting finding that might be linked with how we as people are primed to respond to our environment with the information that people want to see. And maybe it means that we're not cueing to information that we could be seeing even in our own children. And then there could be racial biases on the part of the provider. So one of the studies showed that some providers don't listen or validate Black parents' concerns, meaning that a parent might bring a concern to a provider and they say that's not a big deal, or they present themselves as the expert and the parent on a lesser degree of knowledge, as opposed to seeing assessment in a more collaborative way, which definitely we see happen between Izzy's mom and her school officials, that her concern as a parent was not validated by administration. There's also disparities in treatment, potentially for Black people on the autism spectrum. Insurance is a monster. I don't know, is that an objective statement? I'm a DBT person, but anyways, insurance coverage of evidence-based treatments vary by states. Medicaid doesn't cover ABA in many states. There's limited providers specialized in assessment and diagnosis of autism. When I was preparing for today, I was looking at the prevalence of psychiatrists who specialize in autism spectrum. And one psychiatrist said it's kind of like specializing in autism is the psychiatry of the field, because psychiatry is sometimes not respected in the field of medicine broadly. And so then providers specializing in autism are sometimes not respected by psychiatrists, which is striking. And then, like I was mentioning before, and Dr. Williams mentioned about recruitment and retention, there's not a lot of providers specialized in assessment and diagnosis of autism from underrepresented minority groups. Research and development of evidence-based treatment excludes or does not report racial groups. And sometimes we'll talk about with suicide research, sometimes it even excludes ASD diagnosis as well. So in general, there's a lack of information that's going to be provided in this intersection. There's a dearth for providers and researchers from minority groups. People from underrepresented minority groups who are trained in science and medicine are much more likely to study and care for disenfranchised minorities than white scientists and practitioners, which, if there's less numbers, is already going to create a disparity. But as I alluded to, it also creates kind of a cultural taxation for Black providers if they're the ones that are going into underrepresented minority communities. Even though I love talking about Black people, Black things, Black culture, Black clinical considerations, I'm observing even in myself today that it's been hard. Like, I haven't been sleeping. I've been looking at Izzy's case in a personal way, and taking it to heart, feeling an extra responsibility to do right. And it impacts how I present myself in all kinds of situations. And so we really need balance here, especially on this intersection of Black and autism spectrum. Ways to reduce the gaps: recruit, retain, have psychoeducational programs and parent groups, especially to promote that social support for parents and social support for peers. That helps us to figure out how we can navigate through systems, both of parents and kids. And then we can help by introducing parent training and coaching programs that are evidence-based, but are also culturally tailored. So we know that Black children benefit from interventions that emphasize racial socialization, preparing for bias, as well as increasing pride in their racial group. And so adding that in the coaching and having us as providers normalize that can help reduce gaps. In a study with a bunch of kids with autism spectrum disorder. 9 white kids were found to have a much greater chance of being bullied relative to white kids. And children who were Black were more likely than any other race to perceive school as an unsafe place due to the likelihood of bullying traveling to, from, and at school. And features of ASD are going to contribute to increased victimization, not reading social cues as well. You're not going to be as related to peers. There's barriers to communication. In some cases, the way that you express emotions will be perceived as not acceptable for the environment. And so we can help prevent these things by, increasing family communication, family affection, and guardian involvement in school, which we will talk about, because how do we increase guardian involvement in school when the school itself is not a welcoming place? So what kinds of things are you all familiar with? You could interact with Slido to tailor your existing parent coaching interventions or your existing interventions to be more culturally appropriate. What kinds of things are people doing? Y'all can put them in the chat, put them on the slide somewhere where we can see them. While you're doing that, I'm going to check and see if my next person's here. He's there. I highly recommend that people check out Howard Stevenson's resources on racial socialization and increasing racial literacy. My colleague, Rihanna Anderson, my colleague in contemporary, I should say, has also done a lot with racial socialization with her model Embrace, which is a family and child parallel program to teach racial socialization skills. Aisha Metzger out of the University of Georgia incorporates racial socialization strategies in her work with traumatized kids, and it's incorporated into the TFCBT paradigm. Translating in all languages in the school. Seeing client as the expert in their lives. But also supporting the client as expert in their lives with science-based research so that they don't have to be the expert and the advocate in their lives. Active listening and validation, which also needs to be culturally informed. In TBT, we talk about it, higher levels of validation, that we're seeing people as equals. And like Dr. Williams was saying, it's hard to do that if we're not forming relationships with people. I like all this about collaboration. Collaborative treatment planning, not only involving the family, but the things that are important in their community, like this other commenter is saying. So I'm going to get into bullying. So Sloan is, I didn't want to pass it. Sloan is another one of our clinicians at UCBT, coming to us from New York with a lot of experience with child trauma work, as well as in training people in a diverse environment. We're so glad to have her. She has contributed slides for today. I do not know if she is here, but I will read them. But I appreciate her contribution as well as that of Dr. Rowley's. So I want people to remember this definition of bullying: unwanted aggressive behavior that involves a real or perceived imbalance of power that's then repeated or has the potential to be repeated over time. And it can be physical, verbal, or social bullying. And who is likely to be bullied? again, in bullying, there's an imbalance of power in some way, whether it's in strength or size, cognitive ability, popularity, and often children who bully are targeting people who seem different. And these things, list is very similar to the list that Dr. Williams shared about these places where we as therapists have already agreed to intervene, gain knowledge, and be prepared to not do harm to. Same things that children are likely to be bullied based on physical or cognitive disabilities, weight, race or ethnicity, sexual orientation, family, financial status, social skills. About a fifth of high school students experience bullying during the past year, and children with special needs are at a greater risk of bullying due to a lack of peer support that's been shown to prevent and protect against bullying. This is a graph that shows rates of bullying over the past 10 years by ethnicity. Interestingly, you see that the people who report belonging to two or more racial groups have had an uptick in bullying rates. You also have Asians who report low numbers of bullying, but also have seen an uptick in the past couple of years, and everyone else is kind of on this like slow slant. An interesting thing here to note is that this is also based on willingness to report. And so if people are in situations where they don't feel safe to report, this may be an underestimate on the part of some marginalized groups who may already perceive there to be a lack of safety in their school environment. So the bullying resources suggest not to label kids as bullies or victims because it might send the message that people's behavior can't change. And certainly when we do presentations with the Black clinicians, we often talk about this with calling people racist, or even saying that they engage in racist behavior. It then shifts to a conversation of who people are versus what it is that they're doing. And so we as mental health professionals can help by leading the conversation and focusing on behavior and concretely identifying what can change. Labeling fails to recognize multiple roles children might play, and it disregards other factors contributing to behavior, such as peer influence or the school climate. So again, if school climates aren't safe, then kids are just doing what they are being conditioned to do. And so then how do we intervene there? Bullying is considered an adverse childhood experience. So for people who aren't familiar with the ACEs studies, the ACEs are a list of things that later have connections to trauma symptoms, but also ability to regulate emotions and really help people begin to look at the environment as adults as a result of having adverse childhood experiences. So even though a lot of times people with ACEs are resilient, they also tend to have formed these ways of relating to the environment that are restrictive or perceiving the world as less safe, which as mental health professionals, we tend to see as not being effective for moving through the world flexibly. Among bullied students, 15% missed one or more days of school because of safety concerns. Bullied students are more likely than their peers to be depressed, lonely, and anxious, experience somaticizing symptoms, engage in self-harm, think about suicide, or plan for suicide. So there's a connection between bullying and traumatic stress. So how can we respond? Ensuring the child or teen is safe and seeking ways to prevent future bullying. Talk about what happened and why, to help clear up their how they might feel that they caused the bullying incident. Teaching stress management and relaxation to help cope, and then enlisting professional help when needed. IES. Bullying often happens out of sight, and like we were talking about before with the graph, kids are tending not to report it. And so all of us as caring adults, plus parents and school staff, have a role to play to help kids understand bullying, keep lines of communications open, make sure that kids are accumulating positive experiences to help shield, and that we're being an effective model for how to treat other people. And then there's additional strategies to help support special needs kids at school. And a lot of them involve engaging the students in activities, giving the information they need to engage, but also the information that other students need to help support them, or even teachers need to support them, creating a buddy system, which creates both accountability on the part of the student and another set of eyes for the benefit of neurotypical kid or someone with special needs, involving students in adaptive strategies in the classroom so they can participate in assisting what other people are needing, conducting team-based learning, implementing social emotional learning strategies, and rewarding positive, helpful, fun, inclusive behavior. Okay, so I'm gonna skip. Oh no, I want y'all to think about it though. I do want to skip responses, but think about, when does a teacher become a bully? Remember that the definition of bullying involves an imbalance of power and aggressive behavior that is repeated or can be repeated over time. And so when does a teacher become a bully, or when do we as mental health professionals become bystanders if we're seeing things and not intervening, if we're reading about things in the news and not intervening? So I want to call, where did I put you? Oh, down at the bottom. I'm going to keep going with the intersectional suicide risk. I'm just so excited for Fred Tacover to speak that I keep evoking him where he is not there. But let's get it. So for suicide, generally, suicide is the second leading cause of death among older adolescents and the third leading cause of death among youth ages 10 to 14. But there's all kinds of numbers that you're going to see. We're looking at suicide completion. So the rate of suicide completion increased 35% in this time period, but then there's been a decline in rates since about 2019. But the rates for 10 to 24-year-olds has increased. And in a study by Mental Health America, that kind of did a combination of rating prevalence of mental illness and access to mental health care, Utah rated 50th, I meant to put a TH, 50th out of 51, because Puerto Rico is included in this rating. There have been times where Utah has been dead last at this intersection of prevalence of mental illness and access to mental health care. So this is where we're living. And suicide is the leading cause of death in Utahns age 10 to 24. One of the models that I like to use for understanding suicide risk is looking at the Joyner theory of suicide that involves thwarted belongingness, which is perceiving that they're alone by people, they're alone in their experiences. I need to not be two-minded. Perceived burdensomeness, which is the idea that they're a burden to other people. This is what kind of presents a barrier to discussing their feelings. And then a capacity for suicide, which kind of refers to either beliefs about suicide being different, like they're not moral, there's not a moral violation to complete suicide, or somebody's capacity for pain is higher. These things influence capability for suicide. And then, so the intersection of those three things is going to lead to suicide attempts. So if we look at what's going on with Black kids, the rates for Black youth suicide completions increased in the period between 1991 and 2017, even while the rates for other peers were decreasing. So of completed suicides in the Black community as a whole, 80% are from men, but Black women attempt suicide more than Black men. And for youth, the rates for female youth attempts on suicide is increasing higher, and completions are increasing higher than for boys. The age group of 5 to 11 is the time period where suicide completion rates are increasing faster and outpacing all other ethnic groups. And so this is a big concern. When I was looking into this for this presentation, I saw that not only is this a recent finding in two different time periods, but we've also been seeing this since 2001 intermittently, and that period of time was rating from the 80s up to the late 90s. And so it just illustrates the danger of, for a long time, people would anecdotally say that suicide was not something that happened in the Black community, that it was something for white people, and we've missed opportunities to see rates grow among Black youth, especially with such a vulnerable age range. And this age range, 15 to 17, there were the most recent biggest increases of suicide completion rates occurred, with the annual increases for girls being higher than for boys. So this means that the numbers for kids age 5 to 11 are still low, but they grow. And here we're talking about the raw numbers of rates are increasing. In this time period, Black youth suicide rate nearly doubled, with Black children under 13 being nearly twice as likely to die by suicide than their white peers. This was a percentage that was given in a study around the time of George Floyd, the percentage of Black or African American teenagers who attempted suicide. And around the time of the pandemic and various racial issues in the media, 15% of Black survey respondents had seriously considered suicide in the past 30 days. This is the graph that depicts where we're experiencing a decline for overall trends in suicide. The rates of suicide in the Black community are going up. So even though they're still lower than the average, we still need to be concerned with what is causing it to grow. And then here's the graph that shows, while for overall in the US, we expect people's suicide risk to peak in adulthood. For Black youth, it's peaking in adolescence and early adulthood and then going down. And so then this is an age range that we really need to be aware of. And so I pulled this graphic off of the APA website, suicide prevention with white hands reaching out for each other, which is fine and good. But then the face of suicide prevention might need to look more like this. The graphic on the left is from the Cook Center, which is based in Utah, and they're doing an animated series about suicide prevention. And most of their characters are people of color. And so I echoed the words of the CEO of APA, Arthur Evans, that said, while we were looking at the low rates of suicide in the Black community as being a relative strength that we didn't study, now that rates are going up, we've missed an opportunity to understand what it was about these communities that was keeping the risk low and is continuing to keep the risk low for so long. And then we have the risk of kids with an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. And the interesting thing about suicide risk in individuals with an autism spectrum diagnosis is that a lot of times people with an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis are excluded from depression studies in the US. And so the statistics here are from research in other countries, which makes it complicated to generalize to our population. But the study in Sweden indicated that individuals with ASD are 10 times more likely to die by suicide than the general population. One study reported that 2 out of 3 adults with autism spectrum disorder that weren't diagnosed until adulthood reported having considered suicide. Depression, anxiety, bullying, and ADHD are comorbid conditions that increase suicide risk. And one study says that children on the autism spectrum by age 10 report more depression symptoms than their peers, but they also report them persisting longer, especially if they've experienced bullying. And so all of this may be exacerbated by difficulties in communication, so being able to report what's happening, report how you feel, difficulty on the part of people who are caring for people with an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis and interpreting their emotional expression. Or interesting to think about, we often think about the capacity for repetitive behavior in autism spectrum disorder diagnoses, including self-harm, so head banging or scratching or other things, but we may be missing that this is self-harm as an expression of distress that is more classically associated with suicide as we're used to thinking about it. So if you look at the Joyner model for autistic people or people on the autism spectrum, we see that autistic traits are contribute to the perception of both being a burden to people and being isolated from people by virtue of deficits in social communication and connection. And also the diagnosis of autism serves as a moderator between these distorted belongingness and burdensomeness with suicidal capability. So have I gotten to Kobe yet? Oh, hold on one second. This is the response to, I'm going to skip this. So Davis County, in short, Davis County has now, after being called out by the government, has started a campaign to speak out against racism in the schools. And so, spoiler alert, they made these 2-minute videos that does not mention racism, does not mention autism. It just like generally mentions difference. And so the effectiveness of this is going to be questionable. Now I need to introduce my friend, doctoral candidate to Colby Jackson Band, who has told me to introduce him in all kinds of ways. So he's a licensed marriage and family therapist, which is housed in the Utah for Connection. He is a co-founder of Clinicians, and he is a board member of My Children's Hope, an advocacy organization that seeks to raise awareness of neurodiversity in at-risk communities. And he is a doctoral student at Arizona State University College of Health Solutions. To Colby Jackson Band.
Thank you, Dr. Applewhite. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I don't use slides because technology and I do not get along. And so for those that are asking, I am again at the Utah Center for Connections that is located at 250 West, 540 North in Orem, there with Dr. Williams. I want to be aware of your time. I think we were planning to end at noon, so I'm going to take some advice from my grandfather. I am going to stand up, speak up, and shut up, and kind of get to the heart of this issue. Almost as long as I have been Black, I have been an educator. I took my first job as an educator, the second day of school, first grade, 1987, as a peer tutor, and then have either tutored or taught for most of the last 3 decades. As a sociology teacher, one of the things that we talked about in Intro to Sociology was the research of Emile Durkheim. In 1880s Europe, Dr. Durkheim noticed that suicide rates were about the same from year to year and also from country to country. And the method of suicide also was about the same from year to year. So he wanted to understand what the vulnerability factors were so that he can, one, decide who was most at risk, and two, decide who was least at risk. His research was so accurate in 1880s Europe that we still use it today. What Durkheim found was actually the people who were most at risk for suicide were single Protestant males. So if you understand the culture of that time, the belief was the more faithful you were, the more God was going to bless you. So if you are a single male living faithfully and being blessed, you had basically whatever you wanted. But for some reason, you were most at risk for suicide. Interestingly, the people who were least at risk for suicide were married Catholic females. And if you understand the culture of the Catholic Church, 1880s Europe, I mean, her life basically consisted of, you wake up in the morning, maybe give birth before making breakfast, you clean, you cooked, maybe you gave birth again before preparing dinner. It was basically a cycle of domestic chores and childbirth. Like, that was her life. And yet she was the least likely to want to check out. And it wasn't because she had so much to do. It is because when she woke up each day, she knew what was expected of her. She had a sense of responsibility to the people in her home and to her community, which kept her from wanting to end her life. Similarly, we see that people who do not know exactly what is expected of them are the ones who are most at risk for suicide. So when you look at a culture like the Davis School District, I'm not trying to call them out, but since we already mentioned them, let's just go with it. When you look at a culture where Black children are constantly asked to set aside their culture and the very things that make them them in order to blend into a larger culture, then they begin to lose that sense of who they are and what is expected of them. Cheryl mentioned in the video earlier that children here in Utah by the age of 5 have already been exposed to the N-word. This is the problem. There is an N-word that is spoken in schools in Utah every day, and is not the one that we were talking about. And that N-word is more violent, more destructive than any racial slur. And that N-word is nothing. What we see consistently is the consequence of inaction. Inaction is killing children of color in our schools in large numbers. It's not that we are being called names to our faces. It is that when we are being called names to our faces, we are being told things such as, kids will be kids, they didn't mean it, are you sure that that is what they meant? Somehow in our culture, we have misinterpreted this thing that we like to label free speech, which the Constitution actually calls the right to free speech, meaning that as American citizens, we can have an opinion that is different from the government. We can voice that without fear of jail time or fines. It does not mean that as private citizens, we are able to say whatever we want to say without consequence. Often we forget that the things that we say have an impact that is not always consistent with the intent which they are spoken. As the speaker of language, we are only in charge of the intent. We have no control over the impact. But time and time again, especially in the case of Izzy, she was vocal and her parents were vocal about the impact of what was being said. And she was asked to set aside the reality of the impact and to adopt the speaker's intent. So one of the ways that we can do our part to reduce suicide is we need to take responsibility and accountability for the impact of what we say. And we have to move past this point of inaction. We're going to have to be willing to lean into the uncomfortable conversations. We cannot be comfortable simply saying, I didn't do it. I wasn't responsible for that. Often on social media, I will see comments like, why are we bringing up slavery? I wasn't a slave owner. My parents were a slave owner. And that may be true. However, it is important to understand that the experience of slavery and the emotional impact and trauma of slavery did not end on June 19, 1865. That trauma has been passed down from generation to generation. In order to be able to have this feeling of, I didn't do that to you, I think we have to recognize that sometimes we may be a trigger, or that we may represent a trigger. That is not to say that I believe, or many people believe, that all white people are my enemy or that all white people are evil, because I can't categorize all people into one, just as I cannot speak for every Black person. What I can say as an individual is, I understand that we live in a country with a history such that if I with my brown skin and you with your beige skin share a last name, there is a large possibility that at some point, some member of your family may have owned some member of my family. I'm not asking you to take responsibility for it. I'm not asking you to undo it. I'm just asking you to sit in the uncomfortableness of the history that our forefathers wrote for us, and to join with me as brothers and sisters in deciding what the story of our culture and society will be moving forward. Sometimes we are so afraid to face what has happened that we limit ourselves in what can happen. For example, it appears by the 2-minute video from the Davis School District that it was uncomfortable to sit in the reality that our inaction led to the death by suicide of a 10-year-old student of color in our district. No one wants to feel that burden, and that's understandable. But each event such as that creates an opportunity to regain authorship of our current narrative. I'll warn you, I am a narrative therapist by training. And so my way of intervening and creating change is through language. As we recognize what the narrative has been and why that narrative no longer works for us, then we can decide together what we can do to move forward and to create a different language or a different narrative. And it starts by this, and then I'm going to wrap up. Here in the state of Utah, unlike many other places that I've visited or lived, we have a large number of people from other cultures. But we make the mistake of asking to adopt sameness instead of celebrating our diversity. I believe, and I state that as my personal belief, that as we learn to adopt and embrace the multiple narratives in our culture, in our school districts, in the communities in which we live, the natural solution to racism and prejudice will show itself. Because racism is an institutional issue, the way to overcome it is to change the systems that have sustained it. And the easiest way to do that is by representation. When people of color have a clearly defined role in every system that impacts our daily lives, then we are able to tear down the old narratives and the old systems of power that have placed us and others at a disadvantage and move closer towards this idea of being equal and equitable. So what I would like for you to take from my short time with you today is this. Even though we did not create the problem, each of us has a part to play in the solution. However, placing the bulk of the responsibility to clean up the mess of our past on the shoulders of people of color is not the direction to go. We can help, we can assist, we can consult, but the greatest change will have to come from those who have historically always yielded power in the systems that oversee their day-to-day lives. I am willing, and I'm sure Dr. Williams and Dr. Applewhite as well, I'm willing to continue this conversation so that we're just not talking about the problem, because as my grandfather also told me, a problem without a solution is just a complaint, and 2022 is not my year of complaint, it is my year of solutions. And so I am hoping that we can arrange a time where we can maybe have a more in-depth discussion about what the solution might look like. And again, thank you, Dr. Applewhite, for giving me some time this morning.
Thank you, future Dr. Tacola Jackson Ban. I was struck by what you said about putting things on the burdens of marginalized populations to explain. Earlier when, people were thinking about how we could make interventions more culturally tailored, I saw a lot of responses for active listening, which is nice, but then active listening also is a way to put the burden on people of color to explain, when there's other ways to get information, like doing literature searches, consulting with professionals who are maybe at a different place in their Black identity development where they're not in crisis and they can help. But doing more of the research yourself before listening so that you can start to provide and support, because for somebody to trust you with pieces of their life that are vulnerable to them, it takes effort that maybe active listening won't totally counter the imbalance of. So thank you for bringing that out. Man, we gotta fly. I love my friends. This could have been 6 hours. Okay. So I want to get into the ethics of advocacy and kind of specifically what gets in the way of doing that. We've kind of heard a few people kind of say ACT piece is very third wave, which I love. I acknowledge that part of the reason that I felt the need to host this today and put this on at our center is that my knowledge in the autism spectrum area is not as great as knowledge in other areas, and sometimes that prevents me from intervening in situations where I could do so. And so I'm engaging in this as part of my desire to grow and change. And so we've got some people that are going to talk to us kind of about like advocacy and how we can make that a greater value alignment and push us to action. I'm so excited for this. So Carl is a postdoc at UCEBT, and I have basically I've been waiting for this day for months. That's all I'll say. So Carl is here, and he will present his slides, and I will them. So Carl, if you're here, come on up.
I'm here. Thank you, Dr. Applewhite. Yeah, so I'm here to kind of address the question that was posed. Why might a white clinician shy away from engaging in advocacy work that benefits ethnic minorities, or really anybody who's in a marginalized community? So with that being said, I'm going to do my best to give my perspective on that question in 10 minutes or less. So if you want to go to the next slide, Kimberly. So I really appreciate what Takulva just said. When I'm talking about racism here, I want it to be heard and known that I'm not necessarily talking about the hearts and minds of individuals, like on an individual level. While yes, that still exists, I'm trying to address here the question of systemic racism that still exists and the institutions that keep white supremacy as essentially the norm of American culture. So to define symbolic racism, this is from some literature I did when doing my dissertation. Symbolic racism is kind of when we claim anti-bigotry, but then rigidly hold on to traditionally white, Eurocentric, American, westernized cultural values and expect that everyone else should fall in line with the same ones. So this is what I was interpreting as Takulva was saying when we ask people of color to adopt sameness rather than embracing the multiple narratives. I just loved how Takulva said that. And this is the kind of racism that existed when Izzy was basically ignored when she was crying out for help. So other things can be like criticizing a brown-skinned immigrant for being lazy just because they don't know perfect English. Or in media, there's a lot of portrayals of what Black beauty looks like, but they're Black folks who have a ton of white beauty norm features as being more prevalent. And so that kind of thing is trying to ask folks to adopt sameness versus embracing more diversity. And then aversive racism is more when folks will claim to hold egalitarian views, but then also have these kind of covert anti-minority feelings. And this is where things like microaggressions show up, the model minority myth, things like that, that can kind of, that can really perpetuate psychological dilemmas for folks who are not white and create a lot of societal disparities, like through employment, through healthcare access, through education, housing, these institutions that are in place that are kind of designed to essentially keep those who are in power and keep those who are not as privileged to be, voting, voting access, to keep folks who do not have the same level of power and privilege oppressed. So for the sake of time, we'll kind of skip the next slide. It was just kind of an example where the National African American Culture and History Museum posted some things of what like white culture is and how folks have been asked to embrace that. So this is the stuff in your teeth video that Dr. Williams referenced earlier. Because of time, we can't watch the whole thing, but I'll basically give you the highlight is that this person is saying, Joy Smooth is saying, when we address our blind spots, we can't just say like, oh, well, I learned about racism in a college course, so I'm no longer racist. It's kind of like saying, oh, well, I'm a clean person because I took a shower once. It requires ongoing reflection and ongoing acknowledgement and actively searching out, specifically for white folks, searching out what the blind spots are. So we can still fall into these patterns of racist behavior by not continually examining those things. And so the stuff in your teeth is kind of like saying, rather than taking the paradigm of like, I removed my tonsils, so I no longer have tonsillitis, it's more of like, well, I brushed my teeth once and I discovered some yucky stuff that's in there, but I have to keep brushing my teeth. So I kind of took a note like Dr. Williams was talking about when we're wanting to interrupt the actions and systems of racism in order to save folks' lives, it involves being able to, as white people, not become defensive if somebody points out what is in our teeth. And also be willing to embrace the discomfort that comes with pointing out stuff that is in other white folks' teeth if we notice a blind spot that they just can't see in that moment. So, recognizing that you've engaged in racism doesn't make you a bad person, but just as Dr. Williams was saying earlier, congruence with your outwardly expressed values does require effortful behavior and attitudinal change once you have started that work of trying to uncover blind spots. So if you go to the next 79, want to talk a little bit about white racial identity development here. I was going to go over the whole model by Janet Helms. She's one of the top researchers on that. I basically wanted to, what I wanted to say, though, is that reaching a place of anti-racism for white folks involves first being able to acknowledge that white privilege exists and being able to acknowledge that incorporating whiteness as a factor that I actively identify with, it can oftentimes lead to a lot of feelings of shame and embarrassment when there is a recognition of what white culture has done to oppress and hurt Black folks, Indigenous folks, really anybody who doesn't have the same level of privilege in American society. And so one of the forms of white racial identity development is when white folks start to realize that white privilege maybe exists, and they take a colorblind attitude. So, and this is when we kind of get uncomfortable about what it means to have white privilege, and so we'll say, well, I don't see race, like it doesn't exist. And so then that really kind of invalidates the experience of folks who have to encounter their otherness on a daily basis. And it kind of denies the important differences that do exist. Like DeCulva was saying, that if we were to embrace those differences, it could actually make things a lot better for everyone. So those are some things that I wanted to point out here. So let's go to the next slide and define white privilege. Simply put, the unearned advantages of being white in a racially stratified society, which has been characterized as an expression of institutional power that is largely unacknowledged by most white individuals. So for the next few slides, what I want to focus on is specifically if there has been awareness that has been raised in a white person, and specifically a white clinician who's had the privilege to be engaged in lots of higher education and has had access to these things, why might they shy away? So next slide here. These are several of the attitudes that folks might have towards white privilege. So you find out about it and you feel guilty, as if, well, maybe that threatens my meritorious view of the meritocracy. Like good things happen to those who have merit. So if I have white privilege, does that mean that I didn't earn what I have? Or shame if somebody says, identifies, oh, wow, my in-group has really hurt a lot of people. So if I identify with this in-group, does that mean that I'm a bad person? There's also a whole spectrum of awareness. There's a whole spectrum of remorse, anticipated costs of addressing white privilege, of dismantling it. What is there to lose? And then also a willingness to confront. And these are all aspects of attitudes that white folks might have. So if we go to the next slide here, I asked the question, well, if these different attitudes exist, that doesn't necessarily mean that willingness to confront or dismantle is going to be super low. What is likely to cause that? And so I looked at attributional styles, which is kind of what we attribute our successes, or what we attribute outcomes to. And the multiple sufficient causes can oftentimes lead folks to feel really guilty. So when we say, well, many causes are sufficient on their own, so only one explanation is sufficient, which kind of leads to this reaction of, okay, so if white privilege is the only reason why I've achieved success in society, then I would feel really guilty that I just like took advantage of something I didn't earn. And I believe in the meritocracy, so that must mean that I cheated, and I hate feeling this way. So because I hate feeling this way, and I know I didn't like cheat in any way, that must mean that white privilege doesn't exist. And that mental shortcut can kind of lead to the denial approach to white privilege. Or if we feel ashamed, we can distance ourselves from being white and take on that colorblindness attitude, which again, we know is very unhelpful. We say that the multiple necessary cause is the attributional style that's more likely to lead to the dismantling approach, which is, well, I do have unearned privileges, and that definitely contributes to where I am. And also, that doesn't discount any kind of hard work that I've done or merit that I might have. So next slide here. For the sake of time, I'm going to kind of lump this slide in with the next one. Essentially, the main hypothesis is really something that Dr. Williams already said, is if we become aware and acknowledge and reflect on the white privilege that we have, it can lead to a lot of painful emotions, which is normal. It's okay to feel those painful emotions. And oftentimes we forget that those painful emotions can be very motivating for us to do differently. However, the easy way out is to accept the status quo, to defend the status quo through inaction, just like Takulva was saying. Saying nothing and doing nothing is the same as accepting the status quo, which perpetuates people being hurt. So being able to accept the painful emotions that show up and actively think and behave beyond what society has rewarded and conditioned the beliefs and the attitudes and the behaviors. I'm the first to admit, I every day think of times when I've engaged in microaggressions or when I have held certain attitudes and beliefs that perpetuate systemic racism. And I feel shamed, I feel guilty. And those emotions are acceptable because if I try to avoid them, I'm not going to be living in line with my values, which is to speak up, try to make some sort of change, be an advocate, do something different, change the way that I approach life so that I can embrace the benefits of diversity and try to make it a more level playing field for everybody. So that's my time. Sorry for rushing through it.
No sorries. Thanks so much, Carl. I really appreciated it. Oh, so I also appreciate whoever said in the chat that like the narrative is better than slides, because man, we got to think globally about like what white ethnocentric constructs have done to like expectations of what we feel like presentation should be, because I much rather would have just like sat down and talked to you guys about this. Similarly, as I put in the chat, I know it's 12 o'clock and time is also an ethnocentric construct that many of us have to follow. And so if you need to leave, it is okay. But if you can stay, I would love if you could give this next guest your attention. So I've invited Ray Duckworth to come and speak to us. She's the operating chairperson of Black Lives Matter Utah and has a lot to say about the importance of advocacy, mental health, and I'm sure she'll have some frank words or what we as mental health professionals can do, should have done for Izzy. So Ray, if you're there, come on.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, I'm gonna turn this light off.
You can leave the slide up. That's who I am.
I believe it.
All right. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, that's good on my end.
All right, cool. My name is Ray Duckworth, and I'm the operating chairperson for Black Lives Matter Utah. And I want to thank you guys for staying and sharing this space. It means a lot to me to address systemic racism, anti-Blackness, because anti-Blackness is heavily affecting mental health, and then to address mental health in addition to it all. So I'd like thank you for this. So I got involved with the movement because of my cousin, Bobby Duckworth. He was killed by police, and it was the result of a mental health crisis. So it means a lot to discuss mental health. And I almost am like just at awe for words because of everything that has already been said is like on point. But one thing I just want to highlight and amplify again is disrupting the processes of it all, right? Yesterday we had a vigil for Izzy, and it was at UVU, and it was beautiful, it was empowering, and very emotional. But that's one thing that was addressed there too, is we have to disrupt these anti-Black behaviors every chance we can, because it's targeting these communities so heavily. I'm sorry, like I'm kind of getting emotional because I just listening to you guys all discuss everything. But so anti-Blackness is something that's just, it's part of systemic racism. But anti-Blackness is in every community. Anti-Blackness exists in Black communities. It exists in white communities, Asian communities, Pacific Islander communities. And so Latinx communities, it's existing. And so what we need to do is we need to correct it every chance we can. And anything that corrects that is what I'm asking of everybody, basically. If you see anti-Black behavior, like I am asking you as a mother, as a community member, as someone part of the chapter, I need you to really correct these anti-Black behaviors, because they're affecting our mental health. And I know that like my mental health is affected every single day. I have to sift through it and read complaints of anti-Black behaviors, and a lot of them are happening in our schools. And that is something that I reflect on. I grew up in Utah, So I can remember being 10 years old and having my first thought of suicide. And I know that's something that after Izzy died, a lot of people actually came at me about that. How does a 10-year-old understand or know suicide? Well, being Black, growing up in Utah, and fighting this perfectionism that we like to enforce on our children, and then especially it affects children of color, and I want to amplify women of color. So growing up here, I understand that. I understand that I had that thought at age 10. I had that thought at age 11. I had that thought at age 12. And now 30 years old, I understand that I'm not alone in that thought. So I just want to thank everybody for like letting me come and speak to you all. I know everyone had to get off early, but that's like not a problem. I'm reachable, so you guys can always ask me questions or email me, call me, whatever you need. Anything I can do to provide aid to my community. I know Dr. Applegate was on here talking about trying not to bombard people of color with your questions, because knowledge is everything. But I've put myself in a position to where, Applewhite, I'm sorry, I just was talking to an Applegate. So I had put myself into this position to, I'm okay for you to ask me questions. I'll give you the right answer as best as I can. Sometimes my answers aren't very nice, and it just depends on what you're asking me. But I'm willing to be someone that you can come to and ask hard questions. I'll point in directions. I have book recommendations and anything I can do to just provide the conversation in a proper direction of. So if anybody has any questions, I operate better that way.
So Ray is inviting questions. So if people who are left want to put them in the chat, they can. I also just want to emphasize that Ray is everywhere. So if you look at so many of the things that have happened in the state, instances of racism, Ray is there. And if any of us could be at these places, so that maybe Ray could be at one less place, or feel that she could be supported at these places that she goes with science and knowledge and mental health support that we hold, that would be awesome. And so I appreciate her being here. And Carl's contribution about white racial identity, and often what we bring in with Black racial identity, is that, yeah, there are times where it's developmentally appropriate to seek information from other Black people. There's also a recognition that sometimes those people will not want to give, and sometimes those people will be in a position that they can give. And so Ray said she's given. So I don't know if anybody has any questions or things that they want to put in the chat. What do you think mental health professionals should have done for Izzy?
For Izzy, I think it was the lack of representation in a resource. I think that her being in Davis County, I'm not sure, like I can't even think of a Black mental health professional in Davis County. I can't. And I may be, misspeaking, because maybe someone on this call is in that area. But the fact that, me as a Black woman living in Salt Lake City, I don't know of those clinicians. Do you know what I mean? I don't know of those mental health representatives. So I think that would be the number one thing, is a lack of resource, and a lack of where do you even go to get that resource, because it's so simple. So I grew up in a multicultural home. My mother is white, and I grew up predominantly around her family. So for like, if something happened to like a family member, just go to the doctor. Okay. I had a mental, not a mental health, I had a physical health condition, and I went to a doctor who gave me ibuprofen. And then I had to go see a specialist who gave me ibuprofen. And then you go see another one who just gave you ibuprofen. And then you finally get to someone who looks like me. And it's like 10 doctors later, I get someone who looks like me. And they tell me, hey, first of all, you're not crazy. Oh, thank you. Because 10 doctors later, you start to feel crazy. And then secondly, she's like, hey, this is the issue. Boom, boom, boom. Here, one medication. You don't need to take all of this ibuprofen. You don't need to take it often. And it's this thing. So I think it's a lack of where do you go and where do you go? Where do you start? And am I being represented when I'm going in this route? We also had a really big conversation with 911 dispatch. 911 dispatch is predominantly white. And if you are calling 911 dispatch and they don't understand Blackness, you know what I mean? They don't, because there's no representation in 911 dispatch. And so I really feel like the thing that could have helped Izzy and her family even is having representation and like an easily ready where to go to get that kind of thing. I really think representation matters. And I think that really would have been a big part for her. Because even like when I talk to the family now, you know, I thank the Black clinicians, like you guys did wonderful, because after such a heavy loss like that, to be able to know, oh, there's Black clinicians and they specialize in mental health, and then to tell that family that, like, you put light back into someone's soul almost. And I get emotional just thinking that, because just to be able to be like, there's Black clinicians, but after a loss is that's something else. I wish I could have helped give them the direction to the Black clinicians before losing Izzy. So I really feel representation and understanding representation, and even just being pointed in the direction of representation would have done a lot.
Yeah, thank you. And it's reminding me that it is so important to represent yourself as somebody who can be there for people, and we all can do that. You know, I feel a lot of that same regret for, like, when something happens in the Black community. It's like, why weren't we there? And for people who are not white, like, how do people know that they can come to you and that you will be safe and validating and not dismissive if it's not presented that way? It's hard to know where your resources are. So it gets back to these ethical issues of recruiting diversely, but also working really hard to increase competence in these areas, respect the rights and dignity of people, and be there for them, recognizing the responsibility that we have to be there with that information, and not necessarily make it so that people have to come to us to find it.
Yeah. Like, even when we have conversations, we have lots of conversations with MCOT, and MCOT is working to expand, so they're not utilizing the police to respond to mental health crises, right? So they contacted the chapter like, hey, like, we're trying, but what do we do? And it's like, well, first of all, this flyer that says to call MCOT looks like it's, you know, it's designed for a white person to use. I wouldn't call MCOT, because how do I know you're going to treat me as a Black woman experiencing depression, or a Black woman having a hard day or having anxiety? How do I know that when I'm looking at, you know, MCOT's presentation or their poster, and it's created for the majority? Because, you know, Black people, we make up less than 2% of this state. So like, having those conversations like that will they're very crucial, and it does like, I'm going to amplify you again when you say, like, recruiting. Yeah, go to Black neighborhoods, you know, like, contact Black people and say, hey, these positions are open. And I love that a lot of entities in mental health and physical health, they've contacted the chapter first with their flyers for hiring and recruitment. So we can post that in our groups, in our chapter, so people of color know, oh, these positions are open, and it would be very valuable to have a person of color in these positions to help us all in the long run.
Thank you. Anybody left have questions?
What is an MH community? I might not.
Oh, there's, I think, mental health community probably.
Oh, okay. There you go. Not enough diverse representation in the mental health community. And there's not enough of practice. Yeah, you're right. Like in the schools, there's not equal representation in the school.
It's some districts have one school psychologist that like circles around all the schools, and some have people whose influence is limited, or like the amount of times they could push into classrooms are limited, and then compound that with like lack of diversity in those positions, and then it creates a situation. And what else did somebody say?
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate you.
Oh yeah, we got to look at like recruitment along the pipeline of all of our programs. So then the comment about people being discouraged from applying to graduate school, Ray said a couple of times, like, the flyer, the MCOT flyer, is not something that Black people would be drawn to. 911 doesn't understand the language of Blackness, and it just reminds me how important it is to increase proximity in these communities. And a lot of times what happens when people are trying to enter the pipeline of psychology, they've just been disconnected from people speaking their language for so long, then they get to an applying situation and then are not successful. And so we, in all of our ethics codes, psychology, social work, MFT, there's bits about contributing to recruiting along the pipeline of psychology. So not just at the job level, but at the education level, at a high school level, increasing interest of diverse populations in psychology, all kinds of things. Anybody have any questions? Grad school is institutionalized. Go ahead, Ray.
Oh no, you're good. I just wanted to highlight too. Ooh, I lost it. But like, oh no, I lost it. It went out. My head.
If you find it, then email me and I will send it out. Any other comments before we wrap? Thank you so much, Ray. Ray, what contact would you have people reach you at?
I will put it in the chat.
Okay. So thank you to everybody for joining us. You are free to leave, but I'm going to play you out. This was a song written for Izzy by Izzy's cousin, I want to say. I
think this song was written by the mother of Izzy, Brittany's cousin, I think.
It was written by her. Oh, I'm gonna let y'all play it out. But thank you for joining. If there's any questions, reach out to us at UCEBT. Thank you so much to Ray, to Carl, to LaShawn, to Jacoby, to Sloan, to Laura, everybody who helped. To receive credit, the link is in the chat to the survey, or you have also received the survey, I think, in your email when you signed up for the presentation today. I also want to remind people of the two other talks that we have in our ethics series. The next one, I think, is from Jordan Kugler, something about crisis populations, but that was also would have been in your email when you signed up. Is in the chat, so the link to the survey is in the chat. I do not know if there's a deadline. There is no deadline. I'm going to play the song. Thank you for joining.
A Utah mother says her 10-year-old daughter took her own life over the weekend after being bullied at school. She says she reported the bullying to the school, but claims nothing was done to protect her daughter.
She didn't have the clothes that they were. It took longer to fix her hair. The kids, they just laugh, saying you should take a bath, saying she reads everything backwards. But why don't they ask? Why don't they see that she's a human? Yeah, she's just like them. Was it the fact that she's autistic and has different skin? They teach you sticks and stones can break your bones. Well, why don't they say that words can hurt your soul? She was 10 years old when they took her away. I don't know what you did to her, but it was enough to make a kid give up, to make a kid give up. They should have left you alone. Now you can never come home, and you can never grow up. No, you can never grow up. I don't know what you did to her, but it was enough to make a kid give up, to make a kid give up. They should have left you alone. Now you can never come home and can never grow up. No, you can never grow up. God can take her hand as she lives, but she knows not what she did. While in a class full of kids where supervision exists, and all these memories that'll never leave. How could they not see she wasn't happy? God can take her hand as she lives, for she knows not what she did. While in a class full of kids where supervision exists, and all these memories that'll never leave. How could they not see she wasn't happy? Izzy, we miss you more than ever.
Thanks everybody who stuck it out. Thanks for coming.